So let's get started. I actually asked AI to create an image of digital Taiwan for me, and this is what it came up with. So I thought that was a useful starting point. I actually want to start with two little anecdotes. The first is from 2018. I don't know if you remember the hurricane that hit Japan that particular year. It flooded Kansai Airport. The bridge out there got broken. Yeah, true. And thousands of people were stranded at Kansai. At the time, there was a great deal of rumoring about how the Taipei representative office in Osaka was incapable of helping stranded Taipei travelers. And that sort of got out of hand over the course of a week, and with very negative online sentiment towards the general consul there and their staff, plus the rumor that the People's Republic of China was doing much better. Right, sending buses to Kansai, picking people up, even picking up the Taiwanese compatriots. So, why can't the Taipei representative office get that right? So the general consul went home, took a rope and hung himself, so suicide. And he, in his suicide note, also noted that it was this news that pushed him over the edge. Turned out later, none of that was true. Right? So first of all, the PRC wasn't sending buses and picking people up. People were just generally stranded. The information about the incompetencies at the Taipei representative office were also fabricated. So that's just one pretty gruesome example of how real disinformation and misinformation can get in the way that they cause real harm. Very brief pause to figure out the sound, I suppose, right? Let's see already, yeah? Is it working already? Okay, perfect. So hello everyone at home. I hope you didn't miss too much. I have a second example after this tragic Kansai case, and that's from 2 years ago, which was the news that Taiwan was going to allow 100,000 Indian immigrants into Taiwan. The tech industry requiring more workers, but also South Asian workers in Taiwan are a major part of the labor force there. The news spread online and caused massive backlash from, let's say, right-wing groups with racist tirades about how all these brown men were going to rape Taiwanese women, and it was going to turn Taiwan into a sexual assault island. Again, the information untrue. The Taiwanese government was not planning any such thing. There are immigration plans, but not to that extent. And the degree to which things escalated and became toxic, I think, is, again, something that we all recognize anywhere in the world. But Taiwan is a particularly exciting place to explore these issues because the island has had such a long history of mis and disinformation, dealing with contested information flows. So that's effectively what I want to talk with you about today. These are the results of a research project I did for half a year in Taipei this spring, interviewing stakeholders, I'll get back to that in a moment, and asking them, how do you think about whatever the terminology needs to be? I mean, these are all the sort of buzzwords. And many of the folks I talked to actually said, we don't care about whether we call it disinformation or misinformation or FEMI or malinformation or, all of these things are nice for academics like myself to talk about, and I do think they matter, but they don't really matter that much to the people who are doing the practical work, which is trying to figure out how to immunize their societies against lies and bullshit. And that's something that I think we all need to confront. Europeans, I feel, are sometimes a little bit behind and to some extent have been for a long time quite complacent on this issue. In East Asia, contested information streams have been a fact of life for very, very long. Now I need a monitor. I have to stand here otherwise to see what it is I'm saying. Does this turn? Ooh. Yeah. Because I do want to read also some of the things to you. Yeah, if we can put that on the, that's what that's for, right? The cup. No, not the whole time. That's crazy. Let's try this. Yeah. That's perfect. All right. So sorry for the folks at home. I'm going to keep looking to the other way. So one of the colleagues I asked about especially influence and manipulation campaigns in Taiwan say, for almost a decade now, I've observed that Taiwan has been the country most heavily attacked by foreign forces. Of all the countries under attack, Taiwan is number one. This was a legislator and administrator who was working very specifically on sort of governance frameworks on how to deal with this kind of challenge. It's almost impossible to quantify how big the problem is, but the folks I talked to felt it was very, very serious. One of the other reasons why Taiwan is a fascinating place to look for answers to what to do about these issues is that it has this vibrant activist and democracy tradition with social movements, especially after the Sunflower Movement, also an attempt to digitize politics, digitize democracy, create a more open and transparent society. And that, as we'll see in a moment, also includes a large infrastructure of organizations that deal with fake information. So the question I have for us here today is, how might we deal with these unverified information flows, particularly the ones that turn toxic in our societies today, considering that we're living in hyper-mediated, hyper-modern, hyper-connected societies, and what can we learn from Taiwan in this regard? A quick disclaimer there. Also, one thing that folks in Taiwan kept reminding me of, Taiwan is in many ways special because of, as we'll see in a moment, polarization issues, the political history of Taiwan, but it's also not that special, right? And so folks kept wanting me to also tell folks elsewhere, like here in the Netherlands, to not essentialize what's happening in Taiwan, but to also understand that folks in Taiwan are very much struggling. And one of the reasons they're struggling is often financial. They're underfunded and having a very hard time getting things done with the resources they have. The people I talked to, I think I did 15, 16 interviews while I was in Taiwan with what I would call stakeholders in this kind of issues that included policymakers, legislators, included civil society actors, fact checkers, a whole bunch of academics who are doing analytical work on how to understand dis and misinformation. Very frequently, these people wear two hats, quite similar to America, less commonly the case here, where folks are, say, both academics, but then also politicians, and they rotate with revolving door mechanisms in and out of various ministries. And so I had the chance to talk to people who had that experience, but were then analysts for a couple of years until maybe their party was doing better the next time round, and so on. So the whole spectrum of politics was represented from the left to the right, if we must use that spectrum. So the Green Party, the Blue Party, people more associated with non-aligned groups, critical of both sides, or people who are simply neutral. And also folks with more positive and more negative views of China, which is going to be the elephant in the room anyways. One of the reasons I wanted to do this project now, and I had done a similar project in 2019, where I interviewed folks on digital tech in Taiwan, was that, well, the big shift has been artificial intelligence, particularly the impact of generative AI on mis and disinformation and what that looks like. And I wanted to ask people, how do you feel about deep fakes, right? What is the response to that relatively recent challenge? So I'm going to talk first about some of the challenges and issues that we see in Taiwan, and then some of the responses that people had and how to put out what one of the colleagues there called digital wildfires, right? That's how they viewed the situation in Taiwan. So in terms of the challenges, I think the one thing that almost everyone talked to, unprompted, was polarization and the degree to which Taiwan is divided. And this is quite similar to the US system in a way because of these two big political camps. Taiwan has more parties than just two, but the main ones are the Green Party and the Blue Party, right? The DPP, Democratic Progressive, and the Conservative Party, KMT, which is usually said to be a little bit more pro-China, DPP more independent-oriented. That's a simplification. But in general terms, these are sort of the poles in the debates, and other parties then align themselves with these camps, and the media landscape also aligns itself with these camps, which has reasons that go all the way back to the martial law era and the start of democratization and how media got set up. So that kind of polarization was very much front and center at a lot of people's concerns, with interviewees saying, for example, this: and the problem we need to solve is polarization and trust, and people being able to talk to each other. And also, political polarization has poisoned our societies on almost every issue. And this was someone who had insights into the governing process, saying it had gotten so bad that the competing political parties would reject political proposals and any kind of bipartisan approach simply because the other side had proposed them, even though they were their own agenda points. And so that's how the elite polarization was also becoming a serious problem. And there were speculations of how that affected then also popular polarization, with people reading media content and getting in each other's face over various contested wedge issues. A good example of this is LGBTQ plus rights. There's many issues like this, but this is an interesting example because in 2018, Taiwan was the first society in Asia to legalize gay marriage, and they did that against the public vote, because there was a referendum that the DPP had initiated, hoping that people would get on board with that idea. And it turned out, and people now tell it, due to a lot of mis and disinformation and campaigning from right-wing groups, that the referendum turned out the other way. And people voted against gay marriage, and then the DPP defied that vote. And so one of the issues there, I would give you water, but so yeah, you're okay. One of the issues there was that the dis and misinformation may not have actually come all that much from the Chinese side, which is almost always an allegation in Taiwan, but involved a great deal of right-wing agitation from America. Taiwan has very large Christian groups, and why some of these issues flew so under the radar was because they were often not as digital as people thought they were going to be. It involved, evangelists going into churches, talking with people in person, and spreading misinformation and all the sort of hateful things that people say about gay folks spreading disease and so on, which then took root and spread through line groups, right? So that's the sort of WhatsApp-like app that's popular in East Asia, and it's very difficult to monitor and check and fact check. But people have found some solutions since 2018 to try and deal with these issues. But one of the things that also then became clear with that particular case study, and also in the way that people then talked about it, was that there's very strong generational divides in Taiwan that I think we can also learn something about in terms of how young people and older people don't necessarily talk with each other about cultural and social problems that may not always have these big P politics, geopolitical backdrops, but that divide folks in ways that can then be leveraged by potentially malicious actors. And the other big factor that was on pretty much everyone's mind was social media, corporate social media, and what to do about, for example, Meta, about TikTok, about Twitter, now X. What do you do with these corporations? And the Taiwanese system does have a mechanism to try and nail a single individual person for each corporation as the person who's responsible for what that corporation does in order to generate some kind of accountability. But it is also well acknowledged in the policy sphere in Taiwan that it's very difficult to get these large American corporate actors to do something that the small little society in Taiwan might want. And I think that's something that people in the Netherlands will also recognize, because the leverage is similarly questionable. What can you do as a small European country? You basically need the European Union and its framework. Taiwan doesn't have that kind of background framework, so that makes matters even more difficult. Here's what some people said about social media in that context. Even before the internet, we had rumors, but because of the internet, spreading those rumors is much easier and quicker and more effective than before. So we are concerned because it's kind of terrible. It just keeps evolving and it never stops. And this is what an analyst said. Social media, it's this massive supercharged weapon for exploiting our cognitive vulnerabilities. I would like to see Meta and X set on fire, but that's my personal view. That's also my view, by the way, spoiler alert. So that's the sentiment in much of Taiwan about social media and the corrosive effects that this popularity contest in digital media has. The other, as I said, big elephant in the room is the relationship with China, which is on the one hand a polarizing element, because you have folks, especially on the green side, who are so anti-Chinese that they're basically not willing to take anyone seriously who has anything positive to say about mainland China. But then you also have, and this is, just the evidence is pretty clear, you have Chinese influence operations in Taiwan trying to shift the debate. So it's not just that mis and disinformation are a problem, and the kind of mis and disinformation that's coming out of Chinese sources. It's also that simply the allegation that something might be coming out of Chinese sources can be enough to unhinge the discussion. And so that gives an extra level of problematic, really, to these kind of interactions. Just a couple of words on the Chinese side here. So PRC's political communication strategy is incredibly complex and large and often very messy. It can sometimes seem like there's one strategic communication approach, one big blueprint, and the Communist Party probably wants that to be the case at the top propaganda level, and Wang Huning is developing all these wonderful concepts and so on. But in practice, that's not how it works out, because you have all the way down to the lower levels of this massive political system in China, people engaging in political communication. They all do their own little thing. Then you have commercial actors getting involved. You have the nationalists getting involved and spreading information that's not always very helpful for the Chinese state. But I think the two major sources of information that deal with Taiwan coming out of mainland China are the official communication strategies that come from state media, the state itself. This is sort of public relations, public diplomacy, the sort of things that are unapologetic, right? This is the Chinese government speaking, and it has things to say about something that it considers its own domestic issue. People in Taiwan would disagree, but that's how it looks from the mainland Chinese side. And that includes, for example, CCTV catering and pandering to particular kind of usually home interests in China to talk about Taiwan in ways that are not well received, right? Treating Taiwan as the little sister or little brother that has to come home leads to sort of these memifications in Taiwan with massive backlash. We just had a talk about the Milk Tea Alliance a few weeks ago, which also picks up on people in South and Southeast Asia being very uncomfortable with this nationalist understanding in China and this often patronizing attitude towards smaller regions, and that leads to these sort of jokes about the Chinese nationalists and about the Chinese state. But the more insidious form of information spreading is the covert element. And I'm singling China out here because people in Taiwan keep talking about China. Emphatically, both the Russian state, the American state, all sorts of civil society organizations from elsewhere, corporations, they're all involved in mis and disinformation. It's not just the Chinese side, but because of that, the cross-strait relations, it's a major factor. And again, the analysts have the data to show these are the botnets, right? These are the accounts, and they have IP addresses that we can trace. And also all of this is happening 9 to 5 in Fujian province, right? So probably people are going to the office and they're starting up the botnet and then they're doing their thing. So we have the evidence to show that. And it includes a great deal of sort of astroturfing, right? Fake grassroots sentiments that get generated, sometimes automatically, sometimes by real people sitting there and doing it. It includes buying influencers, either directly buying accounts, or giving them incentives to join sort of a pro-Chinese narrative because it can be very lucrative to do that. That's also what a lot of folks in Taiwan were describing, sort of entrepreneurial propagandists, sometimes Americans, Europeans who get on board with that story because it sells really well with the mainland Chinese nationalists or with pro-Chinese Taiwanese audiences, and you can get a lot of clicks, you can get donations, and so one person here said, there's an economy and a structure that has been set up at the hands of the CCP for building, maintaining, and spreading through, firstly, subsidies, so these direct payments, certain things that get said, and through opening up donations from the PRC to people who say these things. And so this is very difficult to trace and to prove because you have influencers, some of whom are genuine and who truly believe what they're saying, and then you have others who are sort of roped into these economic paradigms, and then there are people who are straight up bought. And so accusing people and saying, hey, your pro-China narrative is bought may not always be helpful because sometimes that's not true. People have these thoughts, right? And then you are very quickly at the line of what is free speech, where should we regulate and where should we not regulate, similar to the problems we see in other societies as well. Overall, if you're wondering what the pattern is of these sort of more covert attempts to shift public opinion in Taiwan, they're often about seeding suspicion, isolating Taiwan and making sure that people there think, the US is not going to help you. You can't rely on Japan. No one here is going to help you. You're all alone. And in that way, to demotivate people and generally up the anxiety levels, right? Up people's emotional problems so that can be exploited. As one person said, it's not about folks actually generally believing conspiracy theories, these large narrative frameworks. It's often enough to just confuse people enough when it matters for the 15 minutes where it matters, for example, during an election, or, God forbid, an invasion, or some kind of war scenario. If you get people to, for 15 minutes, not pay attention to the right thing, maybe that's enough. And so that's kind of the attempt here to already seed enough doubt to make that possible in a crucial moment. And one of the administrators I talked to called this a smokeless war. A lot of people are using sort of Ben Nimmel's framework. I don't know, know him. He worked at Graphica and now works for OpenAI and has created a lot of these frameworks for how to understand false information online. And he said a lot of the intention here is to dismiss, distort, distract, and dismay. And that's also what we see in the Taiwanese case. So is that effective? We've seen many examples where it's been counterproductive. Just the suspicion, as I said, that maybe the Chinese are getting involved has gotten so counterproductive that sometimes the Communist Party rolls things back and says, actually, how about we don't put pressure on people in Taiwan because that might actually lead people to the polls and vote against the KMT simply because someone thinks the KMT candidate is in bed with us, right? We don't want that. We want people to, at least seem and maybe genuinely be independent and then still hopefully tell pro-Chinese messages. And we've seen this in the 2016 election where nationalist agitation from China probably tipped the needle on the election in Tsai Ing-wen's favor for a couple of percentage points. Wouldn't have made a difference, she would have won anyways, but it was quite clear that the suspicion of influence campaigns had an impact. On the other hand, what I just described, this general disillusionment with the information environment, with news media, that can be quite effective and is distorting and worrying at a more fundamental level. So this understanding that there's nothing that can be believed anyways. If we arrive at that point, then it's very difficult to come back from that. And so if the goal is simply to unhinge democratic discussion, then maybe this stuff is in fact quite productive. And this is also then where AI becomes a very serious challenge, not just because of the deepfakes, and those are the sort of a couple of hundred of videos or so, very specialized content created to emulate a prime minister, or emulate a politician saying something that can be just convincing enough for a crucial moment in time to have an impact, but also just the amount of regular fakes that can now be produced by a small number of people, that sort of the AI slop of it all, right? That is a real problem. If you want to see a good take on that, I can recommend John Oliver's last week tonight take on AI slop, which is both depressing and fascinating and very, very accurate. And another issue that people in Taiwan kept raising was the biases in artificial intelligence, whether it's using ChatGPT, but more importantly, using, for example, DeepSeek, with a lot of younger people often not understanding that using a Chinese app like that is going to give you a Chinese perspective. And so there the bias may be subtle, sometimes it's less subtle, but the problem also with ChatGPT, 95% or so of the Chinese data set is mainland Chinese language data. No one meant to create that bias in that sense, but it sort of slides in under the radar for a lot of users. And then you get language and particular conceptualizations of, for example, what democracy might be. That's the mainland Chinese version of that, not the Taiwanese or Hong Kong version or the diaspora version of people using complex character systems, traditional character systems. And so a lot of the discussion in Taiwan is also, can we build a sovereign AI system that will allow people to have a ChatGPT alternative that is homegrown? So let me talk a little bit about, for 5 more minutes or so, about what happens in Taiwan to address these issues. I think one of the big takeaways is that Taiwan has a very robust civil society that includes think tanks, fact-check centers that are independent from the government, or sometimes they do get accused of being green aligned. I would say somewhat unfairly, because they usually work very, very hard to stay neutral. But these are all people who know each other. And one of the things I try to steer clear of is allegations that the Chinese government is involved in mis and disinformation, because they've already learned the lesson that, first of all, it makes them look poor, right? Because they might just be singled out as only targeting the pro-China narratives, and there's plenty of anti-China narratives, Falun Gong groups and so on, also spreading mis and disinformation. So you can't look like you're biased in that regard as a fact checker. But it also isn't helpful, because it immediately puts people who are spreading information on the spot for having aligned themselves potentially with a political group, and then the temperature gets up yet again. It's much better to pick low-hanging fruit topics and try to say, how about we talk about that cancer scare medication disinformation that made the rounds. That is not political, that's bipartisan. Let's just talk about that and convince you all that it makes sense to look at what is or isn't true online, instead of talking about China or Russia or wars and so on. And in that context, we have in Taiwan maybe something that is less prominent in some of the European societies, that Taiwan, after the Sunflower Movement, developed this very strong, or pushed and promoted this very strong hacker community. It existed already before that, but sort of this civic hacking ethos is very big in Taiwan. And these are people who have also got involved with the analysts, with the fact checkers, to try and come up with tech solutions for example, allowing crowdsourced fact checking on the app Line or through Facebook. And to say, this is something that is not just coming from any particular partisan group, but the users themselves are flagging issues here. Kofax is one example of an organization that has done this very effectively, and there's more organizations like it. One of the people I spoke to there also outlined how AI then isn't necessarily just used on the attackers' side of mis and disinformation, but also by the people who are trying to counter disinformation. He said this: what I try to do, and in the future, is to use large language models, those services, to lower the entry barrier for fact-checking collaborators to create quality, useful fact-checking points. So to effectively make their work easier, and that also involved trying to find the right language to reach out to people and talk about mis and disinformation by saying, okay, the information that is coming in is so emotionally charged, we need to reach people in a language that everyone will understand. And as analysts, as academics, as activists, we don't always have the tools to do that. Let's ask ChatGPT, how can I say this so a 12-year-old will understand? And that just speeds up the process in a way that wasn't possible before. So it's not all doom and gloom when it comes to AI. Many people are using LLMs in order to help on that front. One of the big challenges there is that it may already be a little bit too late, because the fact checkers are noticing that there are groups in society that have disappeared into their rabbit holes, into their echo chambers, and reaching them is becoming almost impossible. So again, that's where the work is often slow and is often non-digital, to try and reach back out and arrive at a general consensus that, for example, reasoned debate is something we should all value, regardless of what your political affiliations and alignments are. And that in Taiwan, for instance, must also include a generational dialogue, empowering people to have the language, younger people, for instance, to talk to their grandparents in a way that isn't alienating, but that gets them back on board into the discussion. One other thing that's quite interesting in Taiwan is how activists have been trying to change the script on emotionally sensitive topics, like, for example, LGBT issues, but also on anything that comes up as emotionally divisive in the first place. This is, the humor instead of rumor approach that Cyber Minister Audrey Tang championed, where Taiwanese government agencies are required within 24 hours to respond with a meme to any kind of disinformation that affects their portfolio, and to do so in a way that is humorous but self-deprecatingly so. So not poking fun at the stupid people who've read this stuff and don't get it. That's not helpful, right? That's just more alienating, but to actually make fun of themselves. This is a rumor that spread that the Ministry of Health, I think it was going to pull hair products with chemicals in them that were unhealthy, and was also going to fine you if you have these hair products a ludicrous amount of money, right? You are going to get arrested for having the wrong hair products. And people were like, what the hell, right? This was not true. So the meme here is, this is the claim, it's not true. Look, folks, I'm the minister. I used to have hair like this, but if you use these hair products, you're going to end up looking like me. Don't do it, right? But I'm not going to take the hair products from you. You can do whatever you want. And so that's kind of a fun way to poke fun at yourself. And the reasoning here was that, seeing as mis and disinformation relies so heavily on anger, on negative emotions, the way to defang that is to say, let's just be silly about it, because once people laugh, it's very hard to be upset, right? And then we can have a more reasoned discussion of what is or isn't possible. The final thing I want to talk about here is the relevance of literacy, media literacy, AI literacy increasingly so. This is what some people said here. You need to improve everyone's media literacy, and we cannot debunk every single piece of information, so we think that media literacy is more important than debunking. And this is also where the hard work begins, because this is not something you can just do by flipping a switch. It takes years, if not decades, to do proper media literacy programs, to also desensitize society, to take fact checkers seriously, to look at particular resources, to come back to government agencies and say, I'm actually trusting the government enough to check what the ministry has to say. That's continuous work, and it never stops. Unfortunately, it also costs a lot of money, and with especially US aid crisis, a lot of folks in Taiwan ran out of money and are now having trouble finding resources to do this kind of important work. So let me just conclude here very briefly by highlighting the very real concern that we might be descending into parallel realities where different parts of our societies truly believe that they're living in a particular kind of world of truths, which is a very different world than the other world of truths. And some of those are correct, and it's worth pointing out when something is false. As an academic, I believe this very strongly, but it's also often unhelpful, because beliefs are not countered by telling people you're wrong. Beliefs are countered by showing empathy and taking people seriously. That's also why I think it's important to realize that we're all stupid sometimes. Stupidity is not a cognitive defect, it's a social phenomenon, and our societies, unfortunately, are incredibly stupid. including European societies, which is sometimes a little bit difficult for European liberals to understand. I am just as stupid as the next person, unfortunately. And that has a lot to do with social media, with our social economic problems, with the things that anger us, with the way our networks work. And so there we can learn a great deal, I think, from how Taiwanese actors are talking about this issue and trying to address it. This is another interviewer saying, if a democracy is working, then debating an issue with an open mind is a necessary part. It's a prerequisite for this process. If someone cannot be persuaded with reason or with evidence, then I don't know how much we can do, what we can do to change that. And that is the very threat to democracy, I think. And I think that's also where the malicious actors, the bad faith actors, have a leg up on democratic societies, because they don't need to make anyone believe anything specific. They just have to unhinge that we believe in anything at all. And that's where the risk really is. And that's also what we see Russian disinformation campaigns often leaning into very heavily in Europe. And the problem here is that we are losing our sense, I think, of sociality, of actually treating people as face-to-face people who we interact with as real persons, but rather having these so-called parasocial relationships where you think, oh yeah, I'm on social media following this person, they must like me, and this is, of course, this is not real. And so getting back to actual town hall meetings, rooms like this where we see each other, hey everyone at home, right? You guys too, I love you, right? So actual real human connections, that stuff matters. So I would very strongly urge us all to think beyond the digital solutions. They do matter and there's some value in them for sure. Sometimes you need to address the digital problems in digital ways, but to also keep in mind that many of these digital solutions have attached to them digital and real world problems that we're not going to solve very easily, but we have to put our heads together to figure out what do we do? How do we solve the bigger problems in our societies to take the sting out of what is now becoming effectively a disinformation pandemic? Here's another comment on this. We will need to work out how to still make connections happen, how to reconnect again in that kind of environment poisoned already by mis and disinformation. And I think maybe the biggest thing to keep in mind here is that it all sounds, and I'm the first to use somewhat hyperbolic language to draw attention to how much of a problem I think this is, but it's also important to take a step back, calm down, and realize that it may not be as bad as people make it out to be. This is something I learned in Taiwan quite a lot. A lot of people were sort of rather laid back about the issues, like, you know what, we're still talking to each other. That's the main thing that matters. We don't have to be too panicked about, invasion and all these kind of things that are on the table. And I think that's something we should also learn as a lesson here, to take a breather for a moment. One of the problems I see in Taiwan, and that's probably also an issue here, because the stakes are so high, people frequently talk about the enemy. There's a very real discourse of war and militarist issues, which is informed by the idea that, yes, there is a PLA base in Fujian province where people are doing cyber warfare that attacks people in Taiwan. So it's easy to say, oh, we need to also talk about the enemy and so on. But actually, that's, again, it's counterproductive, because once you fall into the pattern of doing that, the lines are drawn, and that's probably not helpful. There's plenty of Chinese people who are not the People's Liberation Army who you can have a conversation with, right? And so by alienating that whole large group, including the Taiwanese folks who are maybe a little bit on the pro-Chinese side, again, not helpful. So I think that's where keeping calm and not drawing up these dichotomies is particularly important. And maybe that's the lesson we can then also learn here. Keep calm and carry on. Thank you very much, everyone, and I'm looking forward to your questions.